He was an outcast, running from a haunted past. She was a wealthy heiress, left to die in the unforgiving mountain snow. When a rugged mountain man claims a cursed, ice-locked cabin, he doesn't just rebuild a ruined house. He ignites a dangerous romance that will set the frontier ablaze. The wind howling through the Bitterroot Range did not sing. It screamed. It was the winter of 1883, and the Montana Territory was locked in a freeze sunk deep. It snapped the trunks of century-old pines like dry kindling. For Sylvester Gooley, the brutal cold was a welcome companion. It kept the rest of the world at bay. Sylvester was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he walked, broad-shouldered, bearded, and scarred by both grisly claws and the cruel betrayals of civilized men. He had turned his back on society 5 years ago. He survived by trapping, hunting, and trusting no one but his horse, a massive dappled gray named Sterling, and the iron of his Winchester rifle. Sylvester was a ghost of the high ridges, abandoned by the world and perfectly content to return the favor. But even ghosts need shelter when the White Death, the local trapper's name for the season's deadliest blizzard, begins to roll over the peaks. Deep in a forgotten gorge known as Dead Man's Hollow, Sylvester found it. It was a structure completely consumed by the winter. The locals in the valley town of Oakhaven whispered about the place. They called it the Frozen House. Built decades prior by a doomed prospector who perished from fever, the timber cabin had been left to rot. Over the years, avalanches had buried its lower half, and a creeping glacier had literally frozen the structure in time. The windows were shattered, the roof was bowed under tons of snow, and the heavy oak door hung off a single rusted iron hinge. Thick blue ice coated the interior walls like a glass tomb. Most men would have looked at the ruined, frozen house and kept walking. Sylvester looked at it and saw a challenge. He saw salvation. For 3 grueling weeks, Sylvester fought a war against the ice. Working with a heavy steel axe and a crowbar, he hacked away the frozen barricades. He felled straight-backed cedar trees, stripping the bark with his draw knife to fashion new support beams for the sagging roof. He rebuilt the hearthstone by heavy stone, clearing a chimney that had been choked with decades of dead pine needles and snow. His hands bled. His muscles screamed in protest. But the rhythmic strike of his hammer was the only heartbeat in the desolate wilderness. Finally, the day came when Sylvester struck a match. The dry tinder caught, and a flame roared to life in the massive stone fireplace. For the first time in 20 years, smoke billowed from the chimney of the frozen house. The ice on the interior walls began to weep, slowly melting away to reveal the rich, golden hue of old-growth timber. Sylvester was transforming a frozen grave into a bastion of warmth. But the mountain was not done testing him. On the eve of the winter solstice, the true blizzard hit. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. Inside, Sylvester was warm, sitting by the fire, oiling his traps. Over the roar of the wind, Sterling, sheltered in an attached lean-to Sylvester had hastily built, began to whinny frantically. The horse kicked the timber wall, sensing something wrong. Sylvester grabbed his rifle, wrapped himself in a heavy buffalo hide coat, and pushed the heavy cabin door open. The whiteout conditions blinded him instantly. The wind tried to tear the coat from his back. He followed Sterling's gaze, pushing through waist-deep drifts toward a cluster of snow-draped spruce trees about 50 yards from the cabin. There, half buried in a snowdrift, was a splash of crimson. Sylvester waded closer, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't a wounded animal. It was a woman. She was dressed in a velvet riding habit of deep burgundy, a garment meant for a parlor in Boston, not the savage peaks of Montana. A heavy wool cloak was draped haphazardly over her, stiff with ice. Her face was pale as porcelain. Her lips tinged a dangerous dusky blue, and her dark hair was matted with frost and dried blood from a gash on her temple. Sylvester dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to her chest. The heartbeat was there, but it was a faint, struggling flutter, like a dying moth trapped in a lantern. Who in God's name leaves a woman out here to die? Sylvester thought, fury suddenly burning hotter than the fire in his cabin. He didn't hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, shielding her from the biting wind with his own body. Sylvester fought his way back to the warm, glowing light of the frozen house, unaware that by bringing her across the threshold, he was inviting a storm far more dangerous than the blizzard outside. The interior of the cabin was a sweltering contrast to the lethal cold outside. Sylvester laid the unconscious woman onto his own bed, a thick mattress of woven pine boughs covered in thick bearskins. Time was a luxury they did not have. Frostbite and hypothermia were a deadly pairing, and she was in the final stages of both. Sylvester knew the brutal, pragmatic rules of wilderness survival. Modesty had no place when death was knocking. He quickly and efficiently stripped away her frozen, sodden layers of velvet and silk, discarding the icy corsets and petticoats until she was bare. He did the same to himself, down to his long johns, wrapped them both tightly in the heavy bearskins, and held her shivering body against his own. For hours, the only sounds were the crackling of the logs in the hearth, and the violent, terrifying tremors racking her frame. Sylvester fed her drops of warm snow water from a tin cup, gently rubbing her extremities to force the blood to circulate. It was near dawn when her tremors finally subsided, replaced by the steady, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep. Sylvester slipped out of the furs, stoked the fire, and set a pot of venison broth to boil. When she finally opened her eyes 2 days later, the fever had broken. She stared up at the exposed cedar beams of the ceiling, confusion giving way to sheer terror as she realized she was entirely naked beneath a pile of animal skins in a strange rustic cabin. She bolted upright, clutching the furs to her chest, her eyes wide and wild. Where am I? Who are you? Sylvester sat in a hand-carved rocking chair across the room, whittling a piece of kindling. He didn't look up, wanting to give her space. You're in Dead Man's Hollow, and judging by the state I found you in, you're either very lucky or very cursed. Name's Sylvester Gooley. She swallowed hard, taking in his rugged, imposing frame, the thick beard, and the hardened eyes that held a surprising gentleness. Aviana, she whispered, her voice raspy. Aviana Preston. Sylvester walked over, setting a steaming tin mug of broth on a small wooden table beside the bed. Drink that, Aviana Preston. Then tell me why a railroad heiress was left for dead in a blizzard. Aviana's eyes widened. How do you know who I am? The Preston name is stamped on the silver buttons of your ruined coat, Sylvester noted dryly. And only railroad money buys velvet that thick in this territory. As the hot broth brought the color back to her cheeks, the dam broke. Aviana told him everything. She was engaged to Josiah Blackwood, a ruthless, charming magnate who practically owned the town of Oakhaven and the new railway expansion. Her father had recently passed away, leaving her the sole heir to the Preston Land Company. Josiah told me we needed to travel up the pass to check on a logging camp, Aviana said, tears of anger and grief welling in her eyes. But the carriage stopped. His men, they dragged me out. Josiah didn't even look at me. He just told them to make it look like I wandered off and froze. He needs me dead to take the company. Sylvester's jaw tightened. He knew men like Josiah Blackwood. They were the very reason he had fled to the mountains. They measured human lives in dollars and cents. He picked the wrong mountain to dump his problems on, Sylvester grunted. Over the next month, the frozen house became a true haven. Outside, the winter raged on, dumping feet of snow and isolating them completely from the world below. Inside, a fragile but profound bond began to form. Aviana was no fragile flower. As her strength returned, she refused to be useless. She learned to mend Sylvester's heavy canvas gear. She learned to cook over an open flame. And she even helped him pack mud and moss into the remaining cracks of the cabin walls to seal out the drafts. In return, Sylvester found himself softening. The oppressive silence he had cultivated for years was replaced by the musical cadence of her voice. He caught himself smiling when she fiercely debated literature with him, surprised to find the mountain man had a stack of battered Shakespeare and Dickens books hidden in a trunk. He showed her how to read the tracks in the snow outside their window, and she showed him that not all of humanity was corrupt. The turning point came on a bitter February evening. Sylvester was prying up a rotted floorboard near the hearth to replace it with fresh oak. His crowbar struck something metallic. "What is it?" Aviana asked, kneeling beside him in the glow of the firelight. Sylvester reached into the dusty cavity and pulled out an old rusted tin box. The lock was broken. He opened it, revealing a stack of yellowed papers wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled the top document, his eyes scanning the faded ink. He looked up at Aviana, a hard, dangerous gleam in his eye. "I thought old man Higgins built this place," Sylvester murmured. "But according to this deed, he was just a squatter. This land, this entire pass, including Dead Man's Hollow, was surveyed and purchased in 1860. By whom?" Aviana asked, her breath catching. Sylvester turned the paper around so she could read the signature at the bottom. It belonged to her grandfather, Cornelius Preston. "Josiah didn't just want your company, Aviana," Sylvester said, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying clarity. "The new railway line, it has to come through this pass. It's the only viable route through the mountains. If you die, Josiah inherits everything, including this deed. He can build his empire for free." Aviana looked around the warm, sturdy walls of the cabin that had saved her life. It wasn't just a shelter, it was her birthright. It was the key to destroying the man who had tried to murder her. "They'll come back," Aviana said, her voice trembling not from cold, but from a sudden fierce resolve. "When the thaw begins, Josiah will send his men to find my body. He needs proof of death." Sylvester reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her face. It was the first time he had touched her since the night he saved her, and a jolt of electricity passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the desperate, burning romance that had blossomed in the isolation. "Let them come," Sylvester whispered fiercely, his eyes locked on hers. "They thought they left a corpse in a frozen house. They're about to find out they woke up a mountain." By late April, the Bitterroot Range finally began to surrender to the sun. The great thaw did not come quietly. It announced itself with the thunderous roar of distant avalanches and the violent rushing of snowmelt carving new rivers through the granite gorge. For Sylvester and Aviana, the melting snow brought both the promise of spring and a creeping dread. The frozen fortress that had protected them was losing its impenetrable walls. Their bond, however, had only solidified. The survival mechanics of their first few weeks had evolved into a profound, unspoken devotion. Sylvester, a man who had sworn off the company of others, found his gaze lingering on the way the firelight caught the coppery strands of Aviana's hair. Aviana, raised in ballrooms and boardrooms, realized she felt safer in the calloused hands of this rugged outcast than she ever had among Boston's elite. The silence between them broke one evening, as a warm Chinook wind rattled the new cedar shingles Sylvester had fashioned. Aviana was reading one of the worn Shakespeare volumes, her head resting against Sylvester's shoulder on the hearth rug. "When the pass clears," Sylvester said, his voice unusually thick, "I can take you down to Helena. There's a federal marshal there. We can show him the deed. You can reclaim your life." Aviana closed the book, turning to face him. Her eyes, usually bright with defiance, were soft, searching his weathered face. "My life was a cage, built of silk and expectations, Sylvester. I was surrounded by people, yet I was entirely alone until I nearly died in your snowdrift." She reached up, tracing the scar on his jawline. "I don't want to reclaim my old life. I want the life I found in the frozen house." Sylvester's breath hitched. He had fought grizzlies and survived winters that killed lesser men, but the vulnerability in her eyes was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever faced. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, desperation, and a fierce, unyielding promise. It was an oath, sealed in the wilderness, binding the mountain man and the heiress together. But the real world was already marching up the mountain to tear them apart. 3 days later, Sylvester was outside chopping the last of the winter deadwood when Sterling, the gray horse, let out a sharp, anxious snort, his ears pinned back. Sylvester stopped, his axe mid-swing. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of cheap tobacco and unwashed horses. Sylvester dropped the axe and sprinted for the cabin. "Aviana, get the Winchester!" He slammed the heavy oak door shut, just as the crack of a rifle echoed through Dead Man's Hollow. A bullet splintered the door frame, missing Sylvester's head by inches. Sylvester peered through a narrow gap in the window shutters. Below, wading through the muddy, slush-filled basin, were 4 riders. Leading them was Caleb Thorne. Caleb Fletcher, Josiah Blackwood's chief enforcer, a man known for his cruel efficiency. They're not here to look for a body. Sylvester gritted his teeth, racking a shell into his own rifle. They're here to make sure there's nothing left at all. Inside the cabin, Aviana didn't panic. She moved with cold precision, loading the spare revolvers Sylvester had taught her to use. Josiah must have realized the deed to the pass was missing, she said, her voice steady. He sent them to burn the cabin down to hide his tracks. They picked a poor day for a fire, Sylvester growled. The shootout erupted with deafening ferocity. Caleb's men took cover behind the massive felled pine logs Sylvester had cleared months ago, laying down a hail of suppressing fire. Bullets thudded heavily against the thick, old-growth timber of the cabin, but the damp, solid wood of the revived house absorbed the lead like a sponge. Sylvester returned fire with lethal accuracy, his Winchester barking twice. One of Caleb's men screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching a shattered shoulder. "Burn it!" Caleb roared from behind a boulder. "Throw the oil." One of the men produced a glass bottle sloshing with kerosene, lit a rag stuffed in the neck, and hurled it toward the roof. But Aviana was waiting. Resting the heavy barrel of the revolver on the windowsill, she steadied her breathing, tracking the arc of the crude firebomb. She pulled the trigger. The bottle exploded in midair, raining harmless, burning droplets into the melting snow 50 feet away from the cabin. "Good shooting, Boston," Sylvester smirked, though his eyes remained deadly serious. "But we can't stay on the defensive forever. I'm going out the back window. Keep them busy." Sylvester slipped through the rear shutter, melting into the dense, snow-draped timberline like the ghost he used to be. Aviana kept her position, firing methodical timed shots to keep Caleb and his remaining 2 men pinned down behind the rocks. Minutes ticked by in agonizing suspense. Caleb, growing impatient and realizing the incoming fire had lessened, signaled his men to advance. They began to creep forward through the muddy slush, their eyes fixed on the front door. They never saw Sylvester drop from the high branches of a cedar tree behind them. Sylvester landed silently, the heavy wooden stock of his rifle swinging in a brutal arc. He struck the closest man in the temple, dropping him instantly into the mud. Caleb spun around, raising his 6-shooter. But Sylvester was faster. He kicked the gun from Caleb's hand, the force breaking the enforcer's wrist. Caleb howled in pain, stumbling backward into the icy waters of the swollen creek. The last man, seeing his companions fall, threw his hands in the air, dropping his weapons in surrender. The hollow fell silent, save for the rushing water and Caleb's groans. Sylvester hauled the enforcer out of the creek by his collar, dragging him toward the cabin. Aviana opened the door, her revolver still leveled at the men. "Where is Josiah?" Aviana demanded, her voice cutting through the crisp mountain air like a whip. Caleb sneered, clutching his broken wrist. "You think you've won, little lady? Mr. Blackwood is waiting at the bottom of the pass with a dozen men. When we don't come back, he's coming up. You can't fight a whole army." Sylvester exchanged a look with Aviana. Caleb was right. They had won the skirmish, but the war was waiting at the foot of the mountain. Sylvester looked up at the towering, snow-laden peaks overhanging the narrow gorge that led into Dead Man's Hollow. The spring sun had weakened the ice shelves, making them incredibly unstable. "We don't have to fight an army," Sylvester said, a dangerous, calculating glint in his eye. "The mountain will do it for us." Sylvester bound Caleb and his men, locking them in the sturdy lean-to. Then, he and Aviana mounted Sterling, riding hard toward the narrowest part of the gorge, a mile below the cabin. They found a high ridge overlooking the trail. An hour later, the rumble of hooves announced Josiah Blackwood's arrival. He rode at the center of a heavily armed posse, looking furious and impatient. He wanted the deed, and he wanted the Preston woman confirmed dead. Sylvester dismounted, pulling 3 sticks of mining dynamite from his saddlebag supplies he had hoarded for years. He tied them to a heavy rock, lit the fuse, and looked at Aviana. "Hold on to me," he whispered. Sylvester hurled the explosive high onto the overhanging snow cornice above the gorge. The dynamite exploded with a concussive shock wave that rattled the teeth in their skulls. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the mountain groaned. Thousands of tons of wet, spring snow, ice, and boulders sheared off the rock face. The avalanche poured down into the gorge with the sound of a roaring freight train, completely blocking the only path up to Dead Man's Hollow. Josiah and his men below panicked, whipping their horses around and fleeing desperately back toward the valley to escape the crushing wall of white. They were cut off. The pass was sealed. By the time Josiah's men dug through the blockage days later, it wasn't to attack. They were met by a contingent of federal marshals. Aviana and Sylvester had taken a treacherous, hidden hunter's trail down the backside of the mountain, riding straight to the capital in Helena. Standing in the marshal's office, Aviana presented the rusted tin box containing her grandfather's deed to the pass, along with her testimony of Josiah's attempted murder. Josiah Blackwood was arrested in the saloon of Oakhaven, his empire crumbling in an instant. A month later, the spring wildflowers were in full bloom across the Bitterroot Range. The frozen house was frozen no more. The windows were open to the sweet mountain air. The hearth was warm, and the front porch had been expanded to overlook the valley. Aviana stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the scent of pine. Sylvester walked up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. They had rebuilt a ruined house, overthrown a tyrant, and found a love that could weather the deadliest storms. The outcast and the heiress were home. What an unbelievable tale of survival and justice. Sylvester and Aviana proved that even in the coldest, most unforgiving places, true love and undeniable courage can spark a fire strong enough to melt the hardest ice and defeat the darkest betrayals. If this Wild West romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.